We're now ready to move on to our first plenary, and I invite panellists to join me on the stage. So if Ros, Les, Philip, Dinesh, George and Danny can please make their way onto the stage and get comfortable for our next session, that would be appreciated. And as they do so, I've got a few things to share with you. All plenaries are going to be held in this room together. Breakout sessions are in various locations. There are 2 here in this room, 2 at the far end of the Maritime Ballroom on this level, and the others are downstairs. Morning tea, lunch and afternoon tea will all be served in the Maritime Ballroom just across from this room. You may have been there last night for the welcome reception. There is also a prayer room and a quiet room in the building, and please ask any of our staff and volunteers and they will show you the way. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce to you our star-studded panel. Starting with Emeritus Professor Rosalind Croucher. Welcome back onto the stage, Rosalind. Lawyer, academic and one of Australia's most eminent international human rights practitioners, Professor Philip Alston. Great to have you with us, Professor. We have lawyer, academic, Australian constitutional law expert and freshly minted Vice-Chancellor of Western Sydney University, Professor George Williams. Congratulations on your appointment, George. We have a fighter of First Nations rights known around the world as such, Gubbi Gubbi, Butchulla and Gamilaroi man, Les Malza. Great to have you with us, Les. Doctor, lawyer and disability advocate Dinesh Palapana. Hello, Dinesh. And Human Rights Law Centre campaign manager Danny Fadul. Welcome, Danny. Can we please give our panellists a big round of applause? All right. President Ros, I'm going to start with you. The Act means a human rights lens would need to be applied to new laws, policies, pretty much everything, which makes me think of that movie title, Everything Everywhere All at Once. How can something be applied to all of those things at the same time?
I think the language that our superb keynote speakers used was about the empowering nature of tools. And it's the possibility of applying to everything that is the secret to it. It's the foundation, the bedrock of right that provides that enabling tool that can be used by communities, by individuals, by advocates to provide that support. That, I think, is the nub of the answer.
All right, let's get down into the nuts and bolts now. Les, if I can go to you. Queensland's Human Rights Act was suspended twice last year to lock up children, which disproportionately impacted First Nations children. That made international headlines, and at the time the state's Human Rights Commissioner described human rights protections as very fragile. So when a state can have so little regard, do you think a National Human Rights Act would be respected?
I think, in fact, it gives example of how people react to a weakening of a right, and particularly in statute. So there are consequences because of what the Queensland Government proposed to do, and I'm sure there will be a rectification of all that. So I think that statutory laws can be changed, and we've experienced that with the Racial Discrimination Act, like in the Hindmarsh Bridge case or in the Northern Territory intervention case, and in other cases. So they're the negatives of it, but at the same time, it gets the publicity, and I think going back to our first keynote speaker, talking about the strength of the universality of rights and the basis on which those rights exist. So it still does create a platform, I think, for our human rights to be protected.
Because we've got a history of suspending human rights, and there are some delegates in the room that are advocating to raise the age. Is that a human right, to allow children to have a childhood?
Well, I think absolutely. In fact, it is a big issue for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children because of removals and child protection policies and so on. So changing the age of criminality has a huge effect on First Nations peoples, and of course it has created, as I said, this body of reaction to it, which will lead, I believe, to it being overcome, because it is a serious situation. Again, picking up what has been said already, that politicians are a little too prepared, I think, to dismiss the human rights concerns, but having a Human Rights Act does in fact help build that foundation so that the public and the media know right from wrong and know what is the correct way to deal with when breaches of human rights occur. And we see this in Queensland.
Dinesh, that must be speaking your language as well, building the foundation, giving a place to go to when there are breaches. There's a lot being said about the Disability Royal Commission, the 220 recommendations. How effective could a Human Rights Act be in implementing those recommendations?
Yeah, I mean, there were so many things that we found through the Disability Royal Commission, and it is really widespread. The thing is, when I graduated from medical school and when I was trying to access medical school as a person with a spinal cord injury, I remember employment became a really difficult challenge. And I spoke to a friend who was a lawyer at the time, and he said, this is a really difficult thing to get across the line. So there are many things that I come across today, whether it be education, whether it be access to healthcare, human rights are being impinged on every single day. But for people, there is very, very little recourse at the moment. So for the findings of the Disability Royal Commission and the recommendations, I think this will be a really important tool for people with disability to move forward.
What was the thing that you were told was hard to get over the line?
Employment. So it was a real struggle. I graduated from medical school. I had good grades. I did the lot, had references. But for me to start work as a doctor in a wheelchair was incredibly challenging. But there was no way to find a legal recourse for that. It was very difficult. And it was going to be a very challenging road to do that. So fortunately, we got it over the line without doing so. But there are many such issues. And I still see people with disability in my work as a doctor, in my work as an educator, and across the spectrum. But for these people, some of the things that the Disability Royal Commission recommends, it's really hard for them to find a recourse.
So you were told straight out that it was your disability that was stopping them from employing you?
Absolutely, yeah.
Like it was somehow your fault?
Well, yeah.
Danny, religious freedom often impinges on the human rights of the LGBTQIA+ community, who are denied jobs because, similar to what Dinesh was saying, because of their sexuality. How could a Human Rights Act assist that in terms of holding people accountable for breaches of human rights?
Well, the good news is that a Human Rights Act benefits everyone. And what it does is balance human rights so that everyone's human rights are being upheld and respected. And when it comes to LGBTIQ+ people, it's about making sure the right to equality is there at the same time as freedom of religion, so that those rights can be balanced with each other. That's how in Victoria, with their Charter of Rights, you have a situation where the Bendigo Islamic Community Centre were able to use the freedom of religion provisions in the Victorian Charter to make sure they were able to get their mosque constructed against some pretty nasty opposition that they faced from some people who were outside the community. But at the same time, that didn't infringe on the right to equality before the law that LGBTIQ+ people or anyone else in the community could benefit from. And that's why the same Victorian Charter was able to help ensure same-sex couples were able to access superannuation. That is the benefit of having human rights standards at the heart of our laws, making sure those values of fairness, equality, compassion, dignity and freedom are there for government decision-making to be improved and for people to take action when their rights are being violated. And I want to mention a little example earlier about the rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, in particular children. That same Queensland Human Rights Act was suspended twice last year, and that was terrible that happened, but that's a sore thumb. When you look at the rest of the hand, you also see that same Queensland Human Rights Act was able to ensure the cultural rights of the Wangan and Jagalungu people in the Galilee Basin were able to be respected in terms of being able to practice culture on country. You have a situation in Victoria where the Victorian Charter was used to ensure Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children were taken out of a maximum security adult prison, the Barwon case. By contrast, in Western Australia and Northern Territory, similar action didn't succeed. Why? Because they didn't have enforceable human rights standards regarding the protection of children and families. And that's why we've got 101 examples of those charters and human rights acts in Victoria, Queensland and ACT benefiting people on our website, humanrightsact.org.au. Here's a copy of the report. Available at all good online bookshops.
Thank you, Danny. Actually, Dinesh, have you ever done like a Pretty Woman moment and gone back to them and said, "Look at me now, big mistake, huge"?
Sometimes, yeah.
Good. Okay. All right, Philip, would a national human rights act mean Australia would be obliged to respond to matters of international law to which we are a party, or human rights abuses overseas?
The answer that you don't want is no, because that obligation exists anyway. Australia is a party to all of the major international human rights treaties. It's been an active participant, as Michael Kirby and Jennifer Robinson has said, and the Act wouldn't actually change that, but it does signify that Australia is standing up domestically for the values that it will and should already be promoting overseas.
George, how would a National Human Rights Act be applied? Does the Act perform the duties of an umbrella, say, over absolutely everything, or would there be holes that are excluded from the Act?
Well, if you think of what we've got now, of course, we don't have an umbrella. And what we've got now is a bit like walking out in the rain and pretending it's not raining.
Good analogy, actually.
So what we're actually hoping to do is move from that pretending state, which you see in some of the dissenting reports in the parliamentary inquiry, pretending we don't have a human rights problem, pretending we don't have systemic issues with how vulnerable and disadvantaged people are treated in our community. And so the starting point is actually to come to grips with that and be honest and truthful about what's happening in our country and be willing to fix what are deep and systemic problems. So a Human Rights Act is special because it's a systemic fix to a systemic problem. And a good Human Rights Act will be like an umbrella. It will apply to everything that the federal government does and will provide, in respect of that action, a tool, an ability to advocate, an ability to get things changed, where otherwise we would see injustice and human rights being defeated. Now, where that umbrella may run short would be particularly when it comes to states and territories. We're talking about a national Human Rights Act, and there are limits to what we can do in Australia when it comes to states and territories, constitutional limits. So we want a really strong federal umbrella, but we need to get real about the fact that we're still going to have debates at the state and territory level. We need the Queensland, ACT and Victorian instruments, and we also need those instruments in the other states and territories. That will be complete protection, and that's why even if we get this wonderful national instrument, there'll still be work to do within a federated structure that needs federated solutions.
I want to talk about climate for a moment because the Joint Committee on Human Rights last week recommended the introduction of a Human Rights Act. And based on the model, Ros, that you have proposed, they mentioned climate specifically. And last night, Jen Robinson said that she was going to be representing the Vanuatu government in the International Court of Justice, which is driven by the student movement. And I had the absolute privilege and honour of meeting Cynthia Hanuhi from the Solomon Islands during the week. It is going to be world-changing, this particular action. And Jen last night said by 2050 there's going to be 200 million climate refugees. And we are a big source of the emissions that are going to be creating those and the inundation that we're seeing in the Pacific Islands and in the Torres Strait. Who would like to talk about climate and our obligations and the human rights obligations that we don't yet know that we have, evidently? George?
Yeah, I think that there is no doubt that climate change is, of course, one of the most significant concerns when it comes to human rights. There's no doubt about that. And if we're talking about an effective Human Rights Act, it needs to intersect with those concerns. And if we talk again about the umbrella, you need actually to have the capacity for remedies. You need also the ability for legislation to impact decision-making in Parliament and also within bureaucracies. So yes, I would like to see a Human Rights Act, and people should argue, I believe, for protections about a healthy environment, ensuring that these things are dealt with, because otherwise, frankly, people are right to ask questions. What is the value in one of the most largest and significant existential challenges for human rights we face?
And Les, for First Nations people, water accessibility and the right to be able to perform cultural practices and protocols hangs on the climate being right. And there was a traditional owner in the Northern Territory that just this morning made a statement, Tony Wilson said, about fracking, that Tamboran has already been caught out for polluting water. This week, the other big gas company, Empire, was found to have impacted our land. What happens when there are thousands of wells? Our sacred waterways, the plants, the animals we hunt, our children will be poisoned.
Yeah, absolutely, and I'll start off by saying it's a big impact on Indigenous peoples all around the world, and particularly in our Pacific region and Australia. And the Torres Straits is very much a threat as a result of climate change. And it comes down to a number of things. In this case, we talk about fresh water or inland water. It does affect, and we know in Australia, the type of country we are, that water is a lifeblood, and it plays in many different ways a significant role in culture. First off, in relation to the shape of Australia and boundaries of our social connections and so on are often formed by rivers themselves. You've mentioned about underground, about the damage that can be done with fracking. People might remember with drilling, with the concerns about Nookambah decades ago. It was driving into the heart of the Aboriginal people. So culturally, it has a big effect, and as I think we appreciate now, the cultural association with lands, territories and resources, and what we call sacred connection with that and so on, is connected with the reality that Western society would see about the importance of resources, but also with the developed relationship that we have developed over those 60,000 years with those areas. So anything that happens that affects the flow of water or the existence of water is a big part, and already we've seen the protests that are coming from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities about how they're losing access to the waters that they have traditionally been able to access along the Murray-Darling system, for example. So it has a huge impact, and of course it brings into play the importance of recognising the rights that the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have to the natural resources and the well-being of those natural resources, very much linked to the well-being of the people themselves.
And Dinesh, it's not just about the existence of culture and the existence of homes, but it's also about the existence of life.
Absolutely, yeah. And I can give two perspectives on this as a person with a disability. I've been stuck in an earthquake, I've been stuck in a flood, and the mortality rate for people with disability in disaster situations is significant. More risk of death, more people die. And for me, being stuck in an earthquake with no one to help me get down from a building, and stuck in a flood without any access to medical supplies and things, it's a bad situation. And there are other things that affect people as well. So again, for me, other people with spinal cord injury, multiple sclerosis, can't regulate the body temperature. So imagine being stuck in a place like India at the moment where they're experiencing 50-degree temperatures. You're going to die, most likely. So there are hidden populations like this who are more vulnerable, who are more affected, who don't have a voice in this, that we need to think about. My second perspective, it goes back to one of the points made earlier. I come from Sri Lanka. I was born in Sri Lanka, small island, and places like that are affected by big polluters like us. One of the reasons Australia functions is because we as human beings, we follow the road rules, we follow the laws and regulations that are in place. But are we going to do that as a global citizen? Or are we going to be the polluter that affects our neighbours and fellow countries who are more vulnerable? I think we need to think about that.
And that global citizenship has a lot of implications, not just for climate, but for all sorts of things. It's interesting when visitors come to Australia. I met the parents of Matthew Shepherd, who was murdered in a gay hate crime in America, and Judy and Dennis Shepherd believed that Australia had a very good standing with human rights, and said that the world needs to be more like Australia. But Danny, are we as good as that impression?
I wish we could say yes, right? I really do wish. But
We
the
want
problem
to be.
is, we've got royal commissions worth of reasons why that is not the reality for far too many people across our society. Aged care, disability, robo-debt, that's millions of people we're talking about who haven't had their human rights respected systemically. Both sides of politics across the parliament agreed. That's why those royal commissions held on it. And we didn't have a situation where they said, oh, it's just a couple of random problems here, systemic problems. And all of them talked about putting enforceable human rights standards in our laws. We've heard a little bit earlier from Justice Kirby and from Jen Robertson about why haven't we had this Human Rights Act until now? Something else that's in that Amnesty International Human Rights Barometer polling that Jennifer Robertson mentioned, 51% of Australians think we already have one. Now, it could be because they're watching US cop shows, where's my Miranda rights, where's my phone call? But I actually think it's because for most of the people, most of the time, human rights are pretty fine. They don't think that there's a human rights abuse that they're dealing with or confronting. And when they do have one, chances are they're not thinking that's a human rights breach that they're thinking of. So for us, it's about talking about this issue, not just talking about the problems in our society, but also showing what the benefits are of having enforceable human rights standards in our laws. Because once we're able to show those benefits for everyone across our community, then we can get that groundswell to the point where we can have the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights excellent report on a Human Rights Act turned into legislated reality so that everyone across the community can take action when their rights are being breached.
Can I just add from
Yes.
Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander viewpoint, and I've done a lot of work internationally and so on, Australians themselves, I'm talking very generally here, think they are good human rights performers and see the rest of the world as being despotic, and off the planet and so on. And it really is not true, and particularly when you're talking on the topic of Indigenous peoples and looking at what's going on, even with our neighbours in New Zealand or looking elsewhere in the Pacific and Asian regions, but all around the world, Australians are not as good as they think they are, and maybe they need to have something against which they measure performance. I think Australians want to be good human rights performers. I think Australians want to have the standards, but politically and vested interests, they want to have control. As was said, historically, it's been this desire to have control of what does get recognised, what doesn't get recognised.
And Ros, I asked you this yesterday on 10 News First Midday, that we have a problem in this country when racists are attacked, when people calling out racism are criticised more than the actual racist incident of racism. What was your response to that?
Well, I want to loop back for a second, excuse me, because I think what's been resonating really strongly with me is, there is, generally speaking, we're a very rights-respecting society, but what that misses is the invisible bits. Mr. Kirby, Michael Kirby, he likes to be called Mr. these days, as he is a citizen again, spoke of the invisibility of him as a gay man at a time when the rights-respecting Australian society criminalised intimate sex between men. And the invisibility of women, of which Jen spoke, we only get under the surface of that invisibility when we have incident upon incident of individuals whose rights have been egregiously abused, and we get a Royal Commission. And what does that show? Oh my goodness, we hear those that were invisible before. And it's when you have that absence, that silence, that invisible space, you don't see it. And that's the problem, that without that ability to rest on those values that are enshrined in a way that Michael Kirby holds so dear when he refers to that Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which made such an impact on him, and for him showed the absences, the silences, the invisibility that was otherwise there. Hence, we're also supporting now a convention on the rights of older people because of the invisibility of older people in terms of the general protections that you could say apply very well, but when you recognise the invisibility that assumption generates, you have to think again. And in terms of the issue of racism and the issues that my colleague Giri Sivaraman spoke of, our Race Discrimination Commissioner, hello Mr Sivaraman, Commissioner, what it shows is that if you attack the person who is calling out or drawing attention, it speaks to a breakdown under the surface again in social cohesion. And that's the problem that we need to address. And in a way, it's part of the invocation I gave you all this morning in terms of continuing the conversations respectfully, because it's in that respectful space, active listening, that we start to build the understanding.
This Act and the conversations that we're having about the Act come at a polarising time for social cohesion in this country. George, can we have a little chat about what obstacles there might be between this and getting in the way of a Human Rights Act? Or what could we see in the lead up to this Act being proposed?
Yeah, there might be a few obstacles along the way, I think it's fair to say. And I suppose I'd just ask you to throw yourself back maybe 18 months, and if we propose the idea of giving our First Nations a say on the laws that affected them, I mean, surely everyone would agree with that. I mean, that's a pretty uncontentious proposition, and yet we had the most bitter and divisive referendum in our history, and that proposition lost. And it says a lot about the challenges in this area, that even ideas that have rational force, that play well to basic values in this community, that they can be hard to achieve. And when I think of a Human Rights Act, I think of a lot of resonance with those values that should make it, it should make it possible. Indeed, it is possible, there's no doubt. But we are a country that values freedom. We're a country that talks often about the fair go. We're a country that talks about equality. But we're also a country that at this point does not see the language and tools of human rights as being legitimate. And it's important to call that out. I've seen that firsthand so many times. This room does. But in terms of asking, do our politicians, do our institutions, does the community have the political, legal and cultural resonance to say I'm ready for this? Well, I think the answer is not yet, and we've got to win that debate. And to get this done, my starting point would be to assume this is going to be really hard. Unlike the Voice, where the assumption was this will get through, this won't be hard, and we see where it got, you've got to go in recognising this will be a difficult process. It can be won, I have no doubt it can be won. In fact, it's been won in every other comparable country. But this isn't going to be easy. And as to why that is, I think partly it's that, as Danny has indicated, most Australians think we've got a Human Rights Act. So to take the umbrella analogy, if I'm going out in the rain, I've already got an umbrella. You don't need to sell me one. I mean, that's a tough thing to do, to sell somebody an umbrella when they've already got one. We've also got the problem where many Australians think not only have they got it, but they don't have a problem themselves. They don't see this as relevant or resonant to them. So we've got to make that clear. And in fact, every single person in this country has the potential to benefit from a Human Rights Act. At some point, they're going to be dependent upon government services. It could be aged care, they could have a family member with a disability. There's all sorts of reasons, but making it real to them and the stories, I think, are very powerful. And the other thing we have to anticipate is there will be political opposition. And it will be opposed, almost certainly, as we saw in the Parliamentary Committee, is because opposition parties see an upside to opposing this, just as they did the Voice. So you've got to go in recognising that. You've got to plan, you've got to strategise, you've got to have your messages, and at the core, you've got to understand, to overcome that we've got to have powerful stories that connect with people, that help them understand why their lives will be better. And I've absolutely no doubt that is the case. The stories are there, but if we ever lose sight of that, the stories, the connection, the people, the more it's about constitutional law in my area, the more you're going to lose, I'd have to say. It's about people. And Les, I think that's what overcomes those obstacles.
I'd like to get to you. I'd really love to have your thoughts, Les, but Philip, during the referendum debate, it didn't matter how much constitutional experts said that it wasn't, that there were going to be no implications on other people's rights and that sort of thing. The more people thought that it was a conspiracy almost, and the more it divided the community. So what can possibly be done to counter any naysaying when it comes to matters of human rights law?
I think George has raised a lot of issues that are really important and have not been given the sort of attention that they need to get. In my various UN capacities, I visited about 30 different countries made detailed reports on their human rights situations and the problems they faced. But whenever I did that, the challenge was to work out who the potential constituencies were. There wasn't any point in going there and saying, you guys have to embrace human rights because they're terrific and you'd really like them. Huge skepticism. And when I come back to Australia, I see a country that is not very keen on human rights. And so I ask myself, why would the average Australian be interested in supporting this initiative? And it's not that easy. And the thing that for me is really important and has not got the attention that it deserves is the second word, the second noun, free and equal. What's dramatic about the proposals by the Commission and also by the Parliamentary Committee is that economic and social rights are there. My sense is that the average person will almost never see that civil and political rights are things that really matter for them. I'm not Aboriginal, I'm not gay, I'm not a protester, I'm fine. I'm an old white male, I don't need those rights, it's for troublemakers. What we need to do, I think, is to start selling economic and social rights. We haven't done that. The human rights community has neglected them dramatically. Economic and social rights say to people that there is a right to an adequate standard of living, that human rights are about values, not just about courts, not just about violations, but about how we live on an everyday basis. And just to give you one example, which will seem incredibly challenging, most of the people out there who are under 40 will have immense difficulty getting adequate and affordable housing. We've set up a system to ensure that. Those of us over 40 are doing fine, we're getting richer by the minute. Others will struggle perhaps throughout their lives. A commitment on the part of governments to ensure that there really is adequate and affordable housing for every Australian is something that could be done. There are ways to do it, and is something that should mobilise large parts of the constituency. And that's what we really need to do, is to work out who are the constituencies that are not currently engaged, that we can mobilise and demonstrate to them that there's really something in this for them. And I think the reports that are on the table are terrific in terms of embracing that broader approach. And
40% of voters are in that age group 25 to 39. So if this is an election issue going into the next election, then there could be a definite message from that majority of voters. Les, I will get to you. Dan, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I'll make Philip's day. So one of the examples in the Queensland Human Rights Act is about a domestic violence survivor who was being evicted from her housing due to the actions of her abusive ex-partner. And because of the Queensland Human Rights Act provisions, she was able to, with the assistance of Tenants Queensland, raise that issue with the community service provider. That led to that eviction being rescinded. Like, those are sort of examples that we have right now happening in Queensland, Victoria and ACT, where they do have human rights standards at the heart of their laws in those economic and social cultural rights areas. And I think those are the sort of stories that will help show how everyone benefits across our community by having those human rights standards that they can rely on.
All right, Les, such a bruising debate with the referendum. Are we ready, as George suggests, for the vitriol that may come with this?
Well, referring to the referendum, thank you, the fact is it wasn't a bipartisan referendum. It should have been a bipartisan referendum, and doesn't matter whether you're a yes or no voter, the fact that it was wasn't bipartisan, it was going to lose, and I think everyone should have known that. We knew that before, and so on. But the point I wanted to make, which has come up earlier, is Australia already has obligations of human rights through the treaties it's signed. That's too conveniently overlooked, because those obligations are not necessarily enacted in law, particularly the civil and political rights are not there, and they're not there to protect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples when it is an obligation upon the nation. And even Robert Menzies himself said the Constitution is meant to be an evolving document. It wasn't meant to sustain the views that existed in 1900 of we've got to protect ourselves from the black people. You know, it's meant to be evolving. It hasn't been evolving. A Human Rights Act, hopefully, will be part of an evolution. But at some stage, there's got to be, I think, a clear message going across that these are obligations taken for granted in Australia, civil and political rights taken for granted, but not available to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are essentially always closed out when it comes down to those sorts of issues. So a Human Rights Act, I think, is at least a statutory attempt to try and rectify that situation, and as already been said a few times, a constitutional correction is also needed. Thank you.
The Australian public isn't going to be asked to vote on this, unlike marriage equality and the referendum. Do you think that will, I don't know, can limit the amount of vitriol we hear? George?
I mean, it's not going to vote on this, but we do have an election next year. And that's the important point, that in many ways an opposition, if this is debated prior to the election, may make this an election issue. So in essence, that often happens, make this a referendum at the election on a particular issue. We've got migration emerging as a strong issue. It's very clear that the opposition could take a number of points about how this might assist certain people where the media is already railing against people who are in the community, seeking asylum, who've committed crimes. There's a lot there that could be done if they want to, and that's got to be anticipated. And even quite apart from that, just think of the misinformation. There's enormous potential there on social media and the like. And again, this can be one, but you've got to go in with a really honest perspective about how hard it is and what is likely to happen. Yeah. The last time we had a debate like this where I and others were very much involved, what happened was, in the end, it was cast not as a Human Rights Act, but the language was the Pedophiles Charter, is how it was described. And what happened was they mobilised tens of people called electorate officers and the like, and were very, very active at that time. It wasn't, of course, but was very effective. I would say in terms of the political configuration, though, there's been never a better time to get this through. That's the counter-example, because the ALP has attempted to do this in every single occasion it's been in government since World War II, but has been defeated largely in the Senate. The crossbenchers now have the opportunity to get it through. So it's a different political dynamic. But again, I suppose the bottom line is just be prepared. You've got to fight for this if you want it. You've got to get the stories out. You've got to get the narrative out. This will be a tough but winnable campaign. And often it's been lost because people have assumed it's much easier than it actually will turn out to be.
A couple of interesting points coming out of that. Mis and disinformation protections would be very handy right now. But also something that I remembered Justice Kirby saying last night to Josh Burns when Josh said, well, you know, you can lobby your parliamentarians to get this legislation up. And Michael Kirby said, well, they're not in Parliament, but you are. So, Ros, did you have any thoughts about whether this could go before Parliament in this term?
The government's commitment going into the last election was to do a review of Australia's human rights framework. We've got that. The Parliamentary Joint Committee's work came on top of the work of the Human Rights Commission, and we've seen, gave a ringing endorsement to our work. I think the opportunity is there now, going into the next election. Certainly from our perspective, we will be seeking for a response in terms of our work and the Parliamentary Committee's work and the Disability Royal Commission. There is an opportunity to open that conversation as to the what next. But I also wanted to loop back about the politics, and Les, thank you for reminding us about the promises that our governments have made to the world. Early in my term as president, I conducted an exercise for myself, which was the political perspective on human rights protection. And so I got I looked at all those international treaties, and I looked at all the signing and ratifying moments. And I found 21 occasions of signing and ratifying, and I thought 21, okay, I'll take one off, which was a second optional protocol in relation to the abolition of the death penalty. I thought, that's not going to be a political issue. So I took the other 20 occasions of signing and ratifying, promises to the world, red pen for Labor, blue pen for the coalition. I kept going through all of those 20, and you know what the result was? Dead heat. Now, if anything should say, our promises to the world and bringing them home into a domestic law, making those commitments Australian law, that it should be above politics, frankly, I think that is one of those answers.
Yeah, thanks for that, Ros. Dinesh, the people that this Human Rights Act will make most visible, that Ros was talking about a moment ago, could also make them the most vulnerable on our way to this Human Rights Act. Do you think there should be some kind of, is there any way to protect the most vulnerable from what we might hear on the road to a Human Rights Act?
I think, feel that the only thing necessary for bad things to happen is for good people to do nothing. So we can have all the laws, we can have treaties, we can have whatever, but if we see something bad happening and we don't do anything about it, then that's on us. So I think what we need to do is, when we see these things happening, is to stand up and speak against it. And we've seen this. We've seen people become vulnerable through these conversations until these things come to life. But I think the most important thing is for the Australian public to actually stand up, stand by each other, and do the right thing.
Yeah.
There have been times when I was going through this journey, whether it be education or employment, people stood by me. People took risks. People did the right thing. People took personal and professional risks. That's what it's going to take for us as a community. And I think that is the most important thing. When I was living in Sri Lanka as a kid, we had so much division. Sinhalese and Tamil killed each other. Communists and capitalists killed each other. When we were living in a town, they used to kidnap some of their kids, 15 years old, who were suspected of being communists. They locked them up in a dungeon without food or water in the dark until they died. My mum, she risked her life to free some of these kids. And today she says that, so I heard her asking someone, why do you care? Why do you do all this for people and people with disability? She says, because she can. And that's what it is. It's up to us.
Thank you for sharing that, Dinesh. Les and Danny, do you think the Australia that we aspire to be could be realised by the journey into a Human Rights Act?
Do you want to start, Les?
To me, I think we have to aspire to it, and it is possible. Australia does do good things. There's no question about that when it comes to rights. I think the fact is that, as we saw with the referendum, people can feel threatened by a number of things that Aboriginal people do. You hear these things like, I don't want them stealing the barbecue out of my backyard, or things like that. I mean, where do those things come from? It's fear, and it's fear that Aboriginal people are getting a particular right that's been denied. But there's no such thing as special rights for Aboriginal people or Indigenous peoples. It's all the same. It's the things that we're fighting for are the rights that have been denied. So I've always been optimistic, and I've always been optimistic, when things go bad, go south. I don't get pessimistic at that point. I just get more optimistic about, what do we do to deal with that, or where do we go forward from there? So I think that idea to be positive, and at the moment, my current thinking is, as we've heard from the other panellists, is that you look to the elections and look to the political people that are representing us, because that's where the battle is being fought, I think, is the debates about having a Human Rights Act. Shouldn't Parliament keep control of what rights are expressed and how they're expressed? We don't want the courts creating something that is, going to be a threat, I suppose, to vested interests in Australia. So, I think that this is a case of, as has already been said, that let's do the things that are right, and let's be positive and active about doing the things that are right, and try and always work out what is going to benefit. At the moment on the table is this question of the Human Rights Act, and I think that's without a doubt. And I think if people appreciated the fact that it will really only be verifying what we've signed up to since Second World War, and under the treaties and human rights declarations and so on. We've signed up to that in Australia. We believe in that in Australia. We're just suspicious about what it's going to mean for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people upsetting the boat here in a otherwise happy environment for non-Indigenous people.
Yeah, Danny, where our politicians are maybe very polarising in their views about Palestine and or unlikely to even make their position known publicly about issues like Palestine, would you hope that the Human Rights Act would force them to make their position known about the Human Rights Act?
I actually think one of the things that we've seen around this debate for decades has been far too often we talk about the nonsense that's been peddled and then we're responding to the nonsense. And that's a lost opportunity to talk about the possibilities, the opportunities, the positive benefits that we have when we have enforceable human rights standards in our laws by putting those values of equality, of freedom, of compassion and of dignity at the heart of decision making. Because our society, we are deluged in the news by a whole bunch of negativity and terrible thing here, terrible thing there. And that stuff's important to know. But at the end of the day, we're an optimistic, positive society. We should have a conversation that's more geared towards that. Once we have a conversation that's geared towards that, not only are the possibilities of like a Human Rights Act much clearer and stronger, but so are the possibilities for making sure we have that human rights-minded culture in our society. Not just from people doing everyday good things, looking after each other, as mentioned earlier, but also our decision makers thinking consciously about human rights standards and making sure that's incorporated in the decisions they make, the services they provide, and people being confident to take action when their rights are being breached. And that's when you can expand the conversation to all manner of areas in a way that's focused on what unites us, what can bring us together as a community, making sure no one's left behind, but also making sure we're always aspiring for the best, that every child has a quality education regardless of their postcode. Everyone has access to great healthcare regardless of their bank balance. Everyone has a secure place to call home. Those are values that all of us across our society agree on. We don't usually put the label human rights on it, but that's what they are. But the great thing about it is that's what a Human Rights Act can provide. And that is the conversation that we can have together to make sure we win this thing and our society is better for it.
We've got seconds left. Philip and George, is it possible to have an act that does all these things? Philip?
Yes.
I think the most important thing actually is to have an act. There's going to be a lot of debate about what should be in it, about how the right to a healthy environment should be framed, how economic and social rights should be subject to progressive realisation or whatever. But I think having an act, what we see is that there's a certain momentum that comes from it. You have the institutional arrangements, you've got bodies like the Commission, which are then empowered to be constantly pushing the electorate, to be reminding politicians of the obligations that are there. I think we need to think less about legal remedies and courts than we tend to, because that's not ultimately the key. Judges are actually very conservative, and to pin all our hopes on the courts is, I think, largely mistaken. But I think having an act in place that does tell the politicians, that does tell the government that there are certain minimum standards that the community demands is going to make a huge difference. So I'm very optimistic about the potential change that will come from the adoption of this Act. The challenge is mobilisation. And the challenge is not to look to Conservative MPs and others and say, why aren't you supporting this? The answer is to say, you mobilise and make the point to the MP that it's actually in their interests to drop the negativity and to see that supporting this Act is going to help them as well. So it's community mobilisation.
You gave your one-word answer, George. Did you want to have another go? Like seconds.
I would
We
say
have seconds.
yes, these instruments are powerful. They have legal and political power, they have cultural power, and most importantly, they have educative power. They change things in our community, and their real power is they improve people's lives. The evidence is in from around the world and in Australia. And if we get this, I think we can be confident that we'll be making a big and positive difference, in particular to the people who need our help most.
Ros, final words from you. The Commission has drafted a statement that it would like to issue on behalf of delegates after the conference. So there is an actionable on the app. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
I guess it's seeking the commitment from the people in the room as a delegate statement, providing the beginning of that, lighting the blue touch paper that leads towards the change. And I love the way that my fellow panellists have framed things, and it's about that foundation piece of building a culture of rights-mindedness on values, on the positive things, so that we do see those who are invisible, that we recognise the pain that invisibility brings, and that we enable all of us to help to provide effective solutions. And looking to the future, the things that any survey of children through the National Children's Commissioners and have done, the things that matter to our kids are environment, education, and housing. Now, if we miss those in our conversation, but it is about the values that all of us hold dear and making sure that they become tools to improve understanding and commitment to the values we all hold dear. So
Thank you very much. And that draft statement is on your app. So if you agree, all you need to do is tick a box. Well, it's now time for morning tea. It's being served next door, and the next 4 sessions are going to start bang on 11:30. Can you please put your hands together and give a big round of applause to our panel? Rosalind, Philip, George, Les, Dinesh and Danny, and enjoy your morning tea. See you back at 11:30.